Amos and Hosea, Unlocking the Bible by David Pawson. Introduction. Amos and Hosea prophesied during the 8th century BC, and the two books named after them are among the earliest included in the Bible. Although their focus was upon the northern kingdom, i.e. Israel rather than Judah, it is useful to set their preaching within the context of what was happening elsewhere in the world, especially since aspects of modern society can be traced back to this era. We will then look at the situation in Israel before examining the work of the prophets separately. What man was doing? History records that Rome and Carthage were founded in the 8th century BC. Great rivalry between the two cities led to the Punic Wars, in which Rome was finally triumphant. From this victory came the foundations of the Roman Empire. Roman law was gradually established, soon followed by the vast road-building projects, which would have characterized the Romans' reign and would enable the gospel to spread some 700 years later. Also during this century, the Olympic Games began in Greece. Man's obsession with sport has ancient roots, but more significant was the spread of the Greek language throughout the Mediterranean, with Homer being one of the best-known Greek writers. The Greeks established many city-states and developed a new form of government known as democracy, though their approach was some way short of the emancipation that we associate with the word today. In the East, the Chinese and Indian civilizations were also emerging, so that there is a sense in which Israel and Judah were located at the center of the growth of civilization, with developing cultures to the east and to the west, and many travelers passing through the land. What God was doing. God's relationship with his people had reached a difficult phase. His intention was that they should be a model to the world of what a relationship with him was like. This was why he had placed them at the crossroads of the world. His covenant with them, made at Sinai in the time of Moses, stated that if they obeyed, he would bless them more than any other people, and if they disobeyed him, they would be cursed more than any other people. So they were faced with a privilege and a responsibility. But by the 8th century, God was faced with the dilemma of what to do with a people who were far from him. Two kingdoms. A brief outline of their recent history will help to explain God's concerns. By the 8th century BC, the people of God had been split into two. They had become a kingdom with a visible king, as they had wanted some 200 years before, but they had to endure all that went with kingship: taxation to finance the king's lavish lifestyle and conscription to defend the land. But this kingdom had just 3 kings, for it split. The first Saul was the people's choice, good-looking, handsome and tall, but with some serious weaknesses of character. When he failed to live in obedience to God's word, God gave the people a man of his own choosing, David, who is described in 1 Samuel as a man after God's own heart. Despite an excellent start, he too was led into sin. One lustful look led him to break 5 of the 10 commandments, and he was never the same afterwards. The decline in Israel's power began on that afternoon. The third king was Solomon, David's son. He brought great glory to the kingdom during his reign. Israel's empire was at its height, but he did so by heavy taxation and forced labour. He left the legacy of a magnificent temple, but a divided people. The northern tribes were unhappy about the fact that the kingdom's resources had been concentrated on Jerusalem in the south. Civil war ensued as soon as Solomon died. The north rebelled against the south, and eventually the kingdom was divided, with the 10 tribes in the north taking the name Israel, and the 2 tribes in the south who stayed loyal to Jerusalem and to the royal line, taking the name Judah. This meant, of course, that the north was without a temple and without a royal line. They established their own holy shrines at Bethel and Samaria, and their own royal line, independent of the bloodline of David that God had promised to bless. The history of Israel in 1st and 2nd Kings tells a desperate story of the reigns of these northern kings. The average length of their reigns was 3 years. Many of them were assassinated, and there were a number of coups. It was an unstable government, but this is not surprising, for this was not a government based on God's chosen royal line. The south fared better, its kings reigning for an average of 33 years. Interestingly, Jesus is believed to have been this age when he died. Social conditions. Peace. It is important that we understand the social conditions of the north as we seek to understand the messages that Amos and Hosea spoke. It was an era of peace and prosperity. Assyria was the superpower of the day, but Jonah's visit to Nineveh had effectively postponed their threat to Israel for some time. That generation of Assyrians had repented of their evil warmongering, and so the fear of Assyrian invasion was over for the time being. Prosperity. As a result, Israel now enjoyed a time of great prosperity, especially under King Jeroboam II, whose rule for a time stabilized the nation. Its economy benefited from being on the trade routes between Europe and Arabia, and a number of merchants and bankers became very wealthy. Haves and have-nots. Although the standard of living rose, society became divided between the haves and the have-nots. Many enjoyed the consumer society with its luxury goods. The height of fashion was to have a second home, what they called a summer house, to which you would go in the heat of the summer, usually up in the hills. A new aristocracy developed, the get-rich-quick boys. But housing became a problem, because as the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. The rich had second homes, but many people didn't even have one at all. Moral effects. Morally, the effects of all this affluence were very clear. There were financial scandals, bribery and corruption, with even the judiciary being corrupted. There was no justice in the courts without bribing the judges. They were soon into 7 days a week trading because they could make more money that way. Avarice led to injustice, and affluence led to permissiveness. Sexual laxity was the order of the day, and alcohol consumption rose sharply. Although this was 2,700 years ago, the parallels with our modern Western culture are all too easy to see. Religious life. Religious life was also booming, but it was not the religion of Israel. Rather, the people had become interested in the faiths of the other nations, and in particular, they had turned to those of the indigenous peoples of Canaan. This included the faiths of the East and the West that arrived with the travelling merchants and the Canaanite people's cult of Mother Nature. Indeed, at the temples at Bethel and Samaria, the worshippers had sex with male and female prostitutes, believing that this would persuade God to bless their crops. They even set up a golden calf at Bethel in a direct contradiction of God's laws against graven images. So God's holy people, who were supposed to be a royal priesthood and holy nation, had become just like everybody else. God would have been justified in washing his hands of them and trying to start again with another people. But God is not like that. He was married to the people of Israel, and he hates divorce. Having made a covenant with them, he was determined to stay with it. However, he couldn't turn a blind eye to their behaviour. In the giving of the law, at the time of Moses, he promised that he would be forced to curse them if they were disobedient, and the books of Amos and Hosea relate the ways in which he brought discipline to his people. God's discipline. A food shortage. Since the people were embracing fertility cults, it was appropriate that God should demonstrate that their sexual promiscuity did not have a positive effect on the harvest. Instead, a number of harvests failed. God was saying, "Wake up. You're dependent on me, not on the fertility goddesses." But after this disaster as with the others, came the refrain, "Yet you did not return to me." In spite of the food shortage, they carried on with their pagan rituals. A water shortage. Next, God sent a shortage of fresh drinking water, which was of course a great calamity in a land that was dependent upon regular rain. Diseased and ravaged crops. An attack of mildew and locusts destroyed the crops, which led to food shortages for the animals. It may seem obvious that the people who were in covenant relationship with God should turn to him to ask what had gone wrong, but Israel refused to do so. Plagues and raids. The crops and animals had already suffered. Now God sent plagues upon the people, and enemy raids took away their livestock. We can see that each discipline was more severe than the last. Now people were being directly affected, but still they didn't return to God. Storms bring fire. God also allowed lightning to strike some of their cities, resulting in the destruction of vast areas of housing. But none of this had any effect. As long as they could keep their money and enjoy their holiday homes, they didn't care. On top of God's warnings came 2 further disasters. It was as if God was desperate to get their attention. An earthquake. This was much more than a little earth tremor. Some 250 years later, it is mentioned in Zechariah as the earthquake. It demonstrated God's power over the natural realm and reminded the people of the fragility of human life. Yet still the people refused to return to God. Exile. Eventually, God's final sanction was for them to be invaded and deported by the Assyrians, never to return again. This happened in 721 BC, 30 years after Amos and 10 years after Hosea. This may seem a heavy price to pay for disobedience, but God had warned Israel about it time and again, not just through the discipline and the disasters, but also through the ministries of these 2 prophets, who underlined and explained what God was doing and what he might be forced to do. Indeed, Amos 3:7 says, "Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets." God is so amazingly merciful that he never punishes without sending a prophet first to explain to the people what will happen if they continue in their behavior. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation is a warning of what God is going to do with the whole world, but still people don't turn to him. How much more can God do? The Last Chance Prophets. So Amos and Hosea were the last chance prophets sent to Israel, warning them of what God would be forced to do if they failed to turn back to him. The 2 prophets were very different. Amos was tough, Hosea was tender. Amos came with strong accusations of what they were doing wrong. Hosea came with a strong appeal to return to the Lord. If Amos spoke to their minds, Hosea spoke to their hearts. Amos majored on the justice of God, Hosea on God's mercy. Amos communicated God's thoughts to the nation, but Hosea communicated God's feelings. There is some overlap between the 2 prophets, but these broad characteristics shine through their messages. It is interesting that God's very last words in Hosea are a very tender, emotional appeal, hoping that Israel would repent and allow him to refrain from the judgment that he would have to execute. Amos, a rural southerner, Hosea, urban northerner. Amos, warning, Hosea brought wooing. Amos came with tough accusation, Hosea, tender appeal. Amos with the justice of God, Hosea came with the mercy of God. Amos came with divine wrath, and Hosea brought divine love. Amos brought God's purity. Hosea, his pity. Amos addressed social sin. Hosea addressed spiritual sin. Amos addressed injustice, and Hosea addressed idolatry. Amos addressed international, and Hosea addressed national. Amos said, "Seek God," and Hosea said, "Know God."